I think The Boys of Dungeon Lane is Paul McCartney's best album since 2013's New, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you why it's so much better, in my opinion, than 2020's McCartney 3 and 2018's Egypt Station. Now, for this album, he worked with Andrew Watt, who's a producer who's worked with likes of BTS. But what's most interesting is that he's actually been in the position he's in before, where he's working with an older legacy talent who's kind of been seen as a legendary artist at the end of his career. He's worked with Ozzy Osbourne, he's worked with Elton John, and he's actually in the future, album coming out next month, I believe it is. He's working on the new Rolling Stones album. And just a week ago, he worked on the new Paul McCartney album. His influence is immediately known because a song that he actually co-writes with Paul McCartney, he co-wrote 5 of these songs. It opens the album. He's on As You Lie There, and Paul McCartney utilises spoken word in a way that he's never done before, which is very interesting, and perhaps was an influence of Andrew Watt, kind of pushing him in that direction. As far as I know, Paul McCartney's never had a song like this which opens with spoken word. There's these clashing guitars in the chorus of and the bridges of this song, which makes it kind of chaotic and interesting in a McCartney way. But as we end that song, we go into Lost Horizon. This song is more interesting for its lyrics than its production. I kind of like some of the words used. All of a train whistle cutting through town. Still remember that sound. Purring of a car engine, waiting at the light. Laughter from a children's playground. And then he says, that sound can lift me up. That sound can do my head in. And it immediately establishes kind of this was from the get-go, but especially in this song, that there's kind of he's looking back nostalgically, but on mundane parts of life. It's not just about his relationships with the Beatles and what they accomplished, which we hear about a lot later on. It's also about the mundanity of life. My favourite song on this album, purely for the melody, for the interesting and exciting melody, is Ripples in the Pond. And I've heard people criticise the production, but I really think it works on this song. And it's probably the most overproduced so far on the album, but the melody kind of takes me into a good place when it comes to Paul McCartney's kind of wrestling with the authenticity and the kind of stripped back nature of his early solo work, and this kind of new desire to kind of keep up with what's going on in the music world in terms of production, which of course is probably why he worked with Andrew Watt, who is established and talented when it comes to taking an older legacy artist, a more legendary artist at the end of his career, and kind of making them sound more modern and appealing to a younger generation who are now looking on them, trying to find out more about them and listening to their music, keeping in mind that they are a guy making current music, but is a legacy artist who is most known for what they accomplished and what they achieved a long time ago, sometimes decades before that new listener was born. In Paul McCartney's case and mine, it's like 40 years before I was born. He had already revolutionised the music industry with the Beatles. Down South takes us in an interesting direction as he talks about this is a recount of his relationship with George Harrison, who was the guitarist for the Beatles, as you'll probably know, and the early days of hitchhiking from Liverpool down south. He did an interview recently where he talked about going to London with George Harrison and going to Wales with George Harrison. He told a story about being on a milk float and George Harrison getting an electric shock. And this song is the most stripped back. It's pretty much guitar and Paul McCartney, and it's a good listen. And I feel like it's a counterpoint to some of the more heavy production than that we got on this album. We Too and Come Inside are kind of back to back weirdness for me. I'm not a huge fan of the production on these, and I think the lyricism might be lacking at all. But then we get Never Know that follows it directly, and that's more my taste because of the vocals. Like Paul McCartney's kind of doing this like whispery kind of broken vocal, and coupled with the melody, it makes like this really interesting sound, and really like toes the line perfectly between a guy who's this legacy legend, as I said, and this guy who still wants to make current music and kind of stand up there with the likes of Taylor Swift and her contemporaries as a kind of modern artist who's not just making music that you buy because he's Paul McCartney, but is making music you buy because it's good music. The second single released from this album was Home to Us with Ringo Starr, and this is a perfect like recounting of early days in Liverpool. But what's really interesting, I find, is that Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney notably didn't meet until in Hamburg. So whereas you got John Lennon and George Harrison being Ringo and being Paul McCartney's friends in Liverpool, you kind of get this interesting situation where Ringo Starr, although from Liverpool, and of course Liverpool is meaningful to him, the Beatles, the story of Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr's friendship actually does not start in Liverpool. It starts over in Germany, Hamburg, Germany. So it's interesting hearing them both like duet on like this very reminiscent story of Liverpool and being from Liverpool, whilst not kind of knowing each other as children in Liverpool, like Paul McCartney and George Harrison did, which they recount on the previous song. It's quite an interesting dynamic because it feels as though they're solo and they're doing their own thing, recounting different things, but whilst kind of tying it together. The album ends with what I would consider, it's almost like a medley. It's kind of, these songs, it's not a medley, but it fits together like a medley. You know, we get First Star of the Night, which is kind of McCartney kind of talking about, I think he's in Costa Rica, and the demo opens the song, and he's talking about how this kind of, the First Star of the Night kind of takes him into a new place of introspection, and then followed by Salesman Saint, which is kind of a relaying of his upbringing, you know, seeing his dad being a salesman, his mother being a saint, like a nurse, and kind of relaying that part of his childhood. And then Mama Gets By follows that and ends the album, and it's kind of a very beautiful like climax to this, because it talks about like it relays a relationship which is kind of on the rocks and kind of struggling by, but the love between them lets them oversee and overlook each other's differences. And I think what makes this album so much better than McCartney 3 and Egypt Station is how cohesive it feels. I feel like McCartney 3, the songs that really I liked them a lot were Kiss of Venus and Pretty Boys, and there were songs like songs like Deep Down and Sliding, which felt like complete, like so out of the universe that they would fit better on Boys of Dungeon Lane. They just feel like a whole new world. It feels like it's very inconsistent. And Egypt Station is kind of the same. I feel like the singles kind of took that out of the realm of kind of cohesiveness. Boys of Dungeon Lane kind of sounds the most cohesive McCartney album since New, and that's what I kind of like, because New just sounds like one long track. It's with different like kind of elements and parts. It sometimes feels like just one big medley. It's so interconnected, and I feel like Memory Almost Full, the album before that, sounds the same. And I feel like Egypt Station, although it's one of my favorite McCartney albums of the 21st century, I feel like Boys of Dungeon Lane took him back to that kind of new era where he was kind of building like cohesive soundscapes.